You know, I am a guy with a lot of hats that I'm wearing. I'm a journalist, I'm a business owner, I'm a lot of things. But the most consistent thing over the last decade is that I'm a critic. And as a critic, I try to extend levels of professional courtesy, but at the same time, it's kind of difficult to do so because I see consistent problems whenever it comes to the arts in general these days. And it's kind of frustrating. The last video I did about G-Witch, any political stuff aside, and I understand that some people disagreed with me on certain elements of my opinions, which is fine. I think disagreement is healthy. But ultimately, I think that there is a systematic problem. Well, maybe systematic's not the right word, but there's definitely a problem that exists that permeates. Well, that I think is a better phrasing. And in this particular rant video of mine, what I wanted to talk about was the problem of unoriginality. Now, both in the East and in the West, we are seeing this problem where there is just a lack of originality. On top of that, there is a lack of willingness to take any sort of risks. You see, most media these days, and I said this on Twitter and it seemed people agreed with me, is that there's honestly a very risk-averse system these days. Stories oftentimes have either one or two problems. They're either way too safe, meaning that they're not really doing anything interesting or trying to make you think. And if it's taking the safe route, that seems like easy money. If it's not doing that, then it's just writing a type of story that they know is going to get head pats on social media. And that does honestly stretch into different things, like video game companies suddenly feeling the need to have a lot more games with female protagonists. Now, there's nothing wrong with having female protagonists, but take a character like Tifa from Final Fantasy, who isn't the protagonist of Final Fantasy VII, but she's one of the major characters, and she's an incredibly well-written character that's existed for over 20 years. Now take Ellie from The Last of Us. You compare the two, one of them is this really likable young woman who is somebody that you want to learn about and find more out about and things of that nature, and the other one is Ellie. The issue that you run into is that Ellie, in how she was developed in the second Last of Us game, was developed primarily to be the cookie-cutter, strong female protagonist lesbian. And it's ultimately there so that Neil Druckmann can get love on Twitter. It has nothing to do with actual quality. She was, as a lot of people will say, much more interesting in the original. And a lot more likable, to say the least. And by the way, sexual orientation has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with how characters behave. You have a lot of modern writers that have these issues. It's either one or the other. Too safe, or looking for Twitter head pats. Now, when I say things like this, people will immediately jump to, but Japanese media, but anime, but manga. No, these problems exist in Japan too, but in different ways. Japan has more of a problem of being too safe. Most everything that I see that comes out every season is X in another world. Isekai is dominating anime over in Japan in the same way that boy bands dominated music back when I was a teenager. They are everywhere, and it's the same shit over and over and over again. And oddly enough, if you compare a lot of modern isekais to one of the first that I can think of, which would be Aura Battler Dunbine. In fact, that's one of the earlier anime isekais out there. Aura Battler Dunbine is a series that takes a lot more risks and tugs on a lot more heartstrings and ultimately looks to challenge the person who is viewing it. Because it was created by Tomino. Tomino was very good at that. And he loved to do those sorts of things as a writer. He loved to just pour himself onto the page. And it worked because there was a sincerity to it. When you're too safe as a writer, there's no sincerity. It's just a cash grab. And it's unfortunate to see that sort of thing. And in a lot of ways, I honestly think that going for the Twitter head pats is, in a way, over here in the West, another type of safe. It's just not a safe that's going to make you any money. So how do we get around this in the arts? How do we get past this? Well, we have to look back at history. We have to look at the things that were much more acclaimed and what made them so good. I've been watching a lot of old movies and a lot of old shows lately, not just to do reviews on. That's primarily why I just watched Genocybers. I'm going to be doing a series on messed up anime. But I watched The Godfather recently. One of my favorite films ever. Probably top 5 if I ever did one of those lists. And the one thing that I realize about that film is that it was willing to play itself out without apology. It was supposed to be a look at a mafia family. And it does so wonderfully because every single character that is in it is complicated as hell. And that's what makes it, in my opinion, so engaging. You are watching absolute villains at play, and yet these are the kind of people you want to share a beer with. That's the sort of complication I'm talking about. I don't really find that many complicated characters in media these days. Not really. And it's unfortunate to see. And then I look in regards to anime, and I think to myself that a lot of people complain about Shinji Ikari. But how many anime characters have you seen in the last 5, 6, 7 years that have that kind of complexity that he has to him, or has the layers that he has? Or any character from Evangelion. I can't think of very many off the top of my head that I have seen that really are at that level, except for Chainsaw Man. Chainsaw Man, honestly, is going to go down in history as a classic because of those exact reasons. Because of how memorable Denji is, because of how memorable Makima is, and Power, and so on and so forth. Because that's the creator's vision, and he's not apologizing for anything. He's not doing anything safe. It is raw, it is punchy, and it does not let up. And that's why I love it. It embodies a lot of the same spirit that the original Gundam did, that Devilman did, which is obviously Chainsaw Man's biggest influence. And other media of the past, it has the same spirit as Berserk. And I really feel like that is part of the problem, is that's just not there. That's also why in the comic book realm, why I called Jonathan Hickman's Avengers the last great Marvel Comics story, and the last great Avengers story. Some of you might remember that when I did that video. Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, that run, was him just pouring himself out onto the page and making a unique and complex story with a lot of pre-established characters, but he was able to take them in an interesting direction where you didn't really know where it was all going to end up. And there were elements that were tense and were frightening, and there were great battles and all these other things, and it was a phenomenal story because it was willing to take risks and willing to tell stories that challenged perception. The MCU even had some films that did that. For example, everybody I think's, well, not everybody, but most people's favorite MCU film, and I think a lot of people are going to agree with me on this, is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. And for good reason, because that is another film that challenged people, especially in their perception of what makes us safe. Because it was actually, in a very nice and even-handed way, commentating on a lot of the ways that people were looking at national security at the time. And it did it in a way that was easily digestible, but still challenging, because it really wasn't portraying it as a political paradigm of one's a Republican or one's a Democrat. You still like Nick Fury after that film, despite his stances. You still like Captain America, depending on how you end that story. But it was still risky to do because you're essentially commentating on a modern question about, in essence, how government works to protect the people, but doing it in a way that respects points of view, but challenges them in an interesting way with characters that you love. And that, I think, is something that made that movie stand out. I think it's why, or at least part of the reason why, so many people really like that film. And I honestly believe, down to my core, that that's part of the reason that it is probably going to be one of the most beloved films out of the entire MCU. So, as it stands, I think that, if anything, the modern problem I find as a challenge. And I'm going to toot my own horn, and I'm going to sell my own products for a second. So if that sort of thing bothers you, look, I said one of the hats is I'm a businessman. I want people to buy my comics because I believe that I've worked very hard, and I think that I put out something pretty good. And I think that if you believe, like I do, that a lot of these problems are coming around, if you support what I'm doing and you support my business, which in the future isn't just going to be me, guys, announcement coming on that soon, but it's going to be a lot of people that feel the same way that I do, then you're going to get something that is different and challenging and interesting and doesn't pull any punches in regards to impact. When I wrote the very first Inglewood, I told myself that I wanted it to end on a black note. And I don't just say that because the lead character's black. I mean dark as hell. On a note that made you realize the stakes and the darkness of the city around it. And I honestly believe that I accomplished that. You know, the first Inglewood book is far from perfect. I learned a lot from Inglewood Book 1 to Book 2. Anybody who's received the digital version of Book 2 can tell you that. And that's something that I wanted to do, is I wanted to challenge perception and challenge the idea of how you think a superhero comic is going to play out. And on top of that, kind of go to darker areas and in a lot of ways also make you realize that decisions that get made have consequences to them that we don't foresee. And in a lot of ways, we can make our own monsters, which is a common theme in my work. 3 Nights, 4 Days does something very similar. As you guys saw in part 1, there's some cynicism about the Crusades in that book. Now, there's more of it in part 2, which you can back now on Indiegogo. Shameless plug. But there's some criticism of that time period. I get the accusation that because I am doing a book that has Crusaders in it, that it's approving the Crusades, that I'm rubber stamping everything that went on there. No. Anybody who actually read part 1 will see the beginning of chapter 2 in that book, the second half of it, and the first thing you see is one Crusader that killed a bunch of other Crusaders for certain reasons that I won't reveal. I'll just say that is something that happened, and again, not everything is cut and dry. But regardless, that's what I want to do. I think that I have started my career as a comic book writer off in that regard, and I believe that that is what's going to be what sets not just myself, but a lot of other people apart from others. One thing that I really liked about, I just recently got the most recent Cyberfrog book in from Ethan, and one thing I really liked was the final third of the book, because it was willing to tease the death of a character that if they were to die, then it would honestly really be just agonizing to watch. And when I got to that particular page, I was gripped, and now it has me wanting more Cyberfrog. And if Ethan watches this, I'll just say this right now, dude, I'm going to be a pretty quick backer on the next one, trust me. Regardless, as it stands, I believe that that's the way forward. And personally, as just a customer, that's where my money is going to go, is towards creators that I believe are going to consistently try to challenge things and try to tell stories that take some risks and try to do things that aren't exactly what you think are going to happen, and are going to, regardless, try to leave you satisfied at the end. People who embody the spirit of storytellers like Stan Lee and like Jack Kirby, and also like Go Nagai and Kentaro Miura. And those types of people I think are pretty rare. But I'm going to try my best to do that. So I will leave it at this. If you guys believe in what I'm doing, I would appreciate any support you could give, especially in regards to the comic book business. I have a couple of books live on Indiegogo right now, and then one with a mailing list. So the next installment of both the Inglewood and Peregrine franchises are going to happen in Saint Peregrine Dark Night in the Windy City. It is the first crossover book from two characters that are basically flagship characters of two comic book universes. And it's going to be a great book about them fighting something that is supernatural and is just outright dope. It's a great thing. So get on the mailing list. If you get on the mailing list, you get a free print if you back the book physically. You don't even need to buy the secret tier to get that print. Just sign up. I'm giving it to you for free because I'm a nice guy like that. Then, of course, 3 Nights, 4 Days Part 2, which I already mentioned, live on Indiegogo. If you missed out on the first book, check it out. It's some good stuff. And then finally, my novella, American Monsters, The Genesis of Project Lazarus, live on Indiegogo as well. It's a cheap $9 novella. It's only about 100 pages long. But if you're a fan of novellas like The Call of Cthulhu or At the Mountains of Madness, but would like to see a sci-fi twist on it, grab it. You're going to dig it. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and take off. My name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. Have yourselves a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.